Welcome to our training on Agile Scrum. My name is Obalim, and I'm going to be your trainer throughout the duration of this particular training. In this particular training, we're going to be taking a look at the Scrum methodology. Scrum is an Agile methodology. And what that simply means is, within the project management space, there are different frameworks for carrying out projects. When we mention frameworks, framework simply means approaches or ways that you can actually carry out projects. One of the oldest and most popular frameworks is what we refer to as the traditional project management framework. The traditional project management framework is also known as the predictive approach, and then also sometimes called the waterfall, and then it is also referred to as the plan-driven approach. So whichever one we choose to go with. But then one key thing you need to understand about the traditional approach is that typically activities within the traditional project management space is carried out in sequence. And then there are also other features of the traditional project management approach, which of course we're going to explore as we journey along in the course of the training. However, over time, other frameworks started arising. People started asking questions as to how can we do things faster? How can we improve on the already existing frameworks? And that's now what gave rise to what we refer to as the Agile framework. So the Agile framework is encapsulated within what we call the Agile Manifesto, which we're going to see much more later in the course of this particular training. Therefore, based on this manifesto, a couple of methodologies now came up. And one of the most popular Agile methodology is what is now referred to as the Scrum methodology. It is safe to also let you understand that within the Agile framework, there are also other methodologies. For example, there's the extreme programming, there's the lean Kanban, there's also the DSDM, and then aside from that, there's also the APM, which of course means Agile Project Management. So all of these are various methodologies that you have within the Agile framework. However, the focus of this particular course would be on the Scrum methodology. I mean, if you want details on the other Agile methodologies, you may of course refer to my course, which also is on this platform, known as the PMI ACP. And that particular course actually details other methodologies that are also utilized within the Agile space. But then, like I said, the primary focus of this particular session will be on Scrum. This course is designed for those who are willing to launch or enhance their career in Scrum methodology. It's either you are a Scrum Master or you intend on becoming a Scrum Master, or you work within a Scrum environment, or you're a developer, you work within an IT space, or altogether, you're looking at building your knowledge in Scrum methodology. It could also be that you're a project manager already using the traditional approach and you want to begin to use the Scrum methodology. This course is also for you. There are no prerequisites for this particular course. Anybody can actually take this course. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you may choose to pursue the certification by taking up any of the certification exams around the Scrum methodology. So once again, I welcome you to this particular course. It promises to be a very exciting one. I usually suggest, like in all of my courses, that you go through the course at least twice before you choose to write your certification exams. So whichever certification exam in Scrum you've chosen to write, this course would prove very, very valuable towards your success in such exams. A lot of people have actually taken the exam based on my training, and the report has been absolutely amazing. And I'm also sure you're also going to be successful if you choose to go by that. So once again, I welcome you to my class. And then, of course, in subsequent lessons, we'll now dive in, do introduction to Agile and Scrum, and then we shall take a look at other topics we're going to be covering in the course of the training. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. So here in this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at Introduction to Agile Scrum. And this is the agenda for this particular session. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand why Agile is actually very important and why it has become an increasingly popular framework for managing projects. You should also be able to tell me what the Agile Manifesto is. There are 4 manifestos within the Agile framework, and we're going to share those manifestos and explain them in detail. Other things we're going to cover in this lesson would also include the Agile principles. We shall also take a look at Agile project management, then take a look at what Scrum is, do basic introduction to Scrum, and then finally, we shall talk about the Scrum certifications. And these are the things we hope to cover in this very lesson. Okay, so let's dive in. So the question is, why Agile? Why are organizations increasingly adopting Agile? There was a study that was conducted by the PMI, that is the Project Management Institute. And the study showed that usage of Agile methodologies tripled between May 2018 and December 2020. So what that simply means is there is becoming an increasing adoption of the Agile methodologies. And the study also shows that 74% of IT professionals who were surveyed had practiced Agile in some form. In essence, most persons who work within the IT framework, one way or the other, have actually used the Agile methodology. Another study by Gartner shows that 90% of software development projects will practice Agile by December 2021. This particular trend is actually an evolving one because this is 2022. And you notice that most organizations, if not more than 90% of software development projects, actually utilize the Agile methodology. So whichever way you take a look at it, Agile has become a very, very popular framework, and therefore you cannot simply ignore it. So it is a framework that is quite necessary to enable you to effectively carry out your project, especially as it pertains to IT projects or software development projects. Of course, don't forget that some of the lessons within the Agile framework can also be adopted in other spheres. For example, you can take some of the key learnings and adopt it or tailor it to suit whatever project at all that it is that you're carrying out. Now that we have talked about why Agile is important, there's now a need for us to take a look at the traditional development. The traditional development is also known as the plan-driven approach. It is also known as the predictive methodology. And another word it is called is waterfall. The reason why it is called the waterfall approach is basically because in the traditional methodology, things are done in sequence. For example, if we're developing a software, the processes that will be involved or the various stages or phases in that particular software development might include the analysis stage, the design stage, the coding stage, the testing stage, and then the deployment stage. If you're using a traditional methodology, what that portends is, first, you must do your analysis. And then when you're done with the analysis, then you start the design process. And then after the design, would you now go into the coding in that particular order until you get to the deployment? So you can see it looks like a waterfall as we go from one stage to the other. And that's part of the reason why it is called a waterfall approach. It is also referred to as a plan-driven approach because, one, within the traditional space, we usually have a saying that if it doesn't work on paper, it will not work in real life. So there's so much emphasis on planning. And not just that there's so much emphasis on planning, we need to plan the whole project from inception. We need to have a clear-cut plan or definition of done for the totality of the project and how it's going to be implemented. All of these are typically part of what is contained within the plan for the project itself. So that's part of the reason why it's called plan-driven approach. So based on that, we now need to assiduously or religiously follow those plans and try as much as possible to avoid changes. If at all there needs to be changes, they now need to go through a formal change control procedure. Say, for example, we want to make a change in the design of the solution. First, we need to carry out what we refer to as analysis of the impact. Then after that, we now raise a formal change request, which is typically sent to the change control board, sometimes known as the change advisory board. The change advisory board, after careful review, will now either approve or reject that particular change. It is only when that has been done that we can now go back and update relevant documents before implementation starts. So taking a look at these steps, one can already tell that within the traditional space, it is very difficult to implement changes. And not just that it is difficult, it is also time wasting. And in many cases, may not make the project to evolve effectively. So that's part of the reason why it is referred to as plan-driven approach, because you need to plan it all out from inception and then clearly define how the final product would look like even before you commence your implementation. Then we shall also take a look at why it is called a predictive approach. The reason why it's called a predictive approach is because within the traditional space, clarity is the watchword. So we need to clarify everything we need to do with regards to the project itself before we begin implementation. So that's why if you notice in the traditional space, there's a whole lot of documentations. We're going to be creating our project plan, which of course will be made up of our scope plan, our schedule plan, our cost plan, our quality plan, our resource management plan, our communications plan. And then aside from that, we may also include our risk plan, procurement plan, and maybe stakeholders management plan. So you notice that creating all of these plans in most cases is going to take a lot of time, and not just going to take a lot of time, but the idea is clarity. We want to be able to effectively clarify what we want to develop even before we start the development process itself. So that's part of the reason why it is called waterfall approach, because things are done in a sequential method. It's also referred to as plan-driven approach because there's so much emphasis on planning. And then it's also referred to as a predictive approach because clarity is the watchword within the traditional space. Now, it is not altogether bad to say we're going to be doing projects using a traditional methodology. No. And this is also not to say that the traditional approach is not a good way for carrying out projects. But the only thing here is for certain types of project, this type of approach may not be quite effective. First, we're living in a very fast changing world. If that's the case, we should have a kind of project management framework that should be welcoming to changes. Aside from that, we're also living in a very fast changing environment. So if that's the case, then speed should, of course, be our watchword, especially when it comes to development. Because if we're waiting until we clarify every aspect of the project itself before we start implementation, and then also wait until we have been able to deliver the very last feature or deliverable before we launch that particular product, in many cases, by the time we are going to market, we may discover that it is already outdated. Outdated in the sense that that particular need may no longer be existent, or it may have become obsolete. So that's part of the reason why, in order to address some of these shortcomings that we have within the traditional space, Agile now came up to be able to address some of these shortcomings. First, we're going to take a look at some of the problems associated with using the traditional project management framework in software development. One of the key problems or disadvantages is high time to market. Remember, I did explain that within the traditional space, we need to first of all finish the development of the whole product before we go live. If that's the case, let's take a typical example of a software. Say, for example, an application like WhatsApp. If, for example, the developers were waiting until every single feature is included in WhatsApp before it goes live, probably today you and I may not even be using WhatsApp as a means of communication. So that's part of the reason why traditional methodology may actually delay taking the product to the market. Aside from that, it may also lead to low return on investment. Again, because time is money. So while we are waiting until the very last feature has been implemented, and then everything has been figured out before we go live or before we release that particular product, during that particular space, we are not getting returns on investment. Don't also forget that in many cases, before you go live, you may discover that the product is already obsolete. I once had this particular training for a major telecommunication firm. And one of the major challenges they had was the fact that they come up with products, and then when they finish developing that product and they go live or release it to the general public, so they discover that most times when they release this product to the general public, they discover that the taste has moved on. People are no longer interested in such type of product. So I had to advise them to begin to use the Agile methodology. And we're going to see how that works effectively. Aside from that, one of the major problems of the traditional software is lack of customer orientation. Unlike in Agile, the traditional methodology does not include the customer as a member of the project team. And then because of that, many a times, there might be communication gaps. This level of interaction that may be required to enable us to deliver that particular project may not be there. And that's part of the reason why you may have lack of customer orientation as one of the problems in traditional approach. Also, ability to respond to change is low. If you remember when I was explaining how change is carried out within the traditional space, I explained that if there is a need for change, one of the first things that needs to be done is we analyze the impact of the change. Then after the analysis of the impact, then the project manager now needs to raise a change request. This change request is now sent to the change control board or the change advisory board. And then based on that, the change control board can either approve or reject the change. But if the change is approved, then we go back and update any document that the change would affect before we start implementation. So if you notice, this is a very long cycle. And because of that, it will make change very difficult to implement, and then also slows down the rate at which changes can be made in the project. We're waiting for approvals, we're waiting for the change control board to sit, and then of course we do a change request and all of that. All of this, in many cases, would of course affect our ability to respond to change. Traditional project management method, especially as it pertains to software development, may also lead to poor productivity. What that simply means is there might be too much activity without corresponding output, because a lot of the effort may be dissipated in doing a detailed planning, requirements gathering, documentations, and all of that. So you notice that activity is actually taking place, but not focused on the core. So that's part of the reason why you may have poor productivity as one of the problems here. There might also be too much rework. If, for example, we're waiting until the product has been fully developed, which is what typically happens within the traditional space. Now, truth of the matter is, if we now discover that there is an error or there's a problem somewhere, it means we need to backtrack and possibly begin to do all of these things all over again. And that's what we refer to as too much rework. So you may have a situation where you need to scrap all that you've been developing and begin the process afresh or begin the process all over again. And that's one of the major disadvantages of using the traditional approach. And then also, we have come to notice that most times quality is bad. And the reason is because quality inspection is treated as a separate process. So it is not inspected in the course of the development itself if you're using the traditional methodology. And then because of that, we will discover that softwares are developed with a whole lot of quality issues and then also a whole lot of problems. And because of that, the traditional methodology gives rise to high level of project failure, rate of over 68%. Studies show that most projects developed using the traditional software development method, either they come in late or they were not completed at all or totally cancelled. And then in many cases, the value of the product delivered by the project becomes obsolete by the time the project is completed. So some of these problems, as well as other findings, now led to what we refer to as the Agile approach. Other findings, of course, include the fact that in many cases, users do not always use more than 20% of the features of a solution or a system. These problems, and then also outcomes of various research, now gave rise to a need for a new methodology. Some of those research included research that was carried out by the Standish Group, which of course reported that when it comes to usage of features in a system, only about 20% of features in a solution or a system are always used. A typical example is your mobile phone. If you notice, most of the components or the features of that particular mobile phone are barely used. I can reasonably tell you that within your mobile phone, there are only a few apps, about maybe 4 or 5 of them, that you actually use always. And then a lot of them probably are now in their sleep mode or even are never even used at all. And that's why the study shows that 64% of features that you have within a system are rarely or never even used at all. So if we break down that analysis further, it clearly shows that only about 70% of features within a particular system are always used, 13% are often used, 16% are sometimes used, 19% are rarely used, and then 45% of features in a system, in most cases, are never used. If that's the case, is there no way we can focus development effort on these top 20%? So if we're able to develop them, and then of course go live, and then also let users begin to use them, while we gradually add up or iterate to add up these other additional features, this type of thinking, as well as the problems that were associated with the traditional project management approach, was part of what now gave rise to what we refer to as the Agile methodology. The Agile methodology evolved over time. It did not just start today. It started with some level of experimentation, with people trying to use incremental or iterative approaches in order to deal with some of those problems we identified with the traditional methodology. Remember when I was explaining the traditional methodology, I did explain that it had a lot of shortcomings because there was so much emphasis on planning. If you remember the PMP certification course back in the years, that was focused on the traditional methodology. If you notice, the course had a whole lot of content and then a whole lot of processes. There were, I think, about 49 processes with documentations for each of those processes, which of course typically explains why the traditional project methodology has a lot of documentations and then also a lot of detailed planning. So in order to deal with this, people started experimenting with doing things in iterations, shorter time period, and then of course being able to determine if they will be able to get better results in doing that. And that's essentially how Agile evolved over time. So increasingly, we started having what we refer to as the rapid application development, as well as the spiral models. These were some level of modifications of the traditional methodology to make it more iterative and incremental. Iterative simply means doing it in shorter time frames. And then, of course, incremental simply means adding more features as we do further iterations. So the Agile term came into being when 17 practitioners agreed on a common set of guidelines and principles for such approaches. Those 17 practitioners, of course, included the likes of Ken Beck, Mike Biddle, Alistair Cockburn, Ward Cunningham, Martin Fowler, and then also Jim Highsmith, John Ken, Andrew Hunt, and then also Ken Shaber, as well as other practitioners whom we're going to see much more later in the course of this particular training. But it was not until in 2001 that we now had the formation of the Agile Alliance, and then which now gave rise to what we refer to as the Agile Manifesto. And since then, the Agile Manifesto has been the bedrock or the basis upon which the various Agile frameworks, the likes of Scrum, and then of course, extreme programming and some other Agile frameworks were built or developed upon. Now, let's take a look at the Agile Manifesto. So this is the Agile Manifesto, as can be seen from agilemanifesto.org. And it goes thus: we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. So what this manifesto is simply saying is, we're taking a look at some of the practices that we have in traditional project management methodology and reversing them. It's more of saying we're going to do the opposite of essentially what you're asking us to do in the traditional framework. And that's essentially what the Agile Manifesto focused on. If you remember, within the traditional framework, I did explain that there are a whole lot of processes and tools. And I talked about the PMP, of course, before it was updated to its recent version. The PMP, which of course was initially based on the traditional methodology, identified 49 processes that typically should be implemented or followed in order to enable us successfully carry out a project. From the develop project charter process to the identify stakeholders, then of course you develop your plan, your scope, your resources, all of those processes, about 49 of them. And each of these processes had what we call tools and techniques. Tools and techniques. Tools and techniques simply refers to the transformation agents that we require to enable us perform those processes. Now, Agile now comes and says, is there a way we can de-emphasize processes and tools? No doubt, nobody is saying that processes is bad. But what we're simply saying is there a better way of doing things? Yes, processes and tools are good. However, individuals and interactions are better. So instead of we focusing on certain processes, let's focus on collaboration. And then the second part talks about working software over comprehensive documentation. Within the traditional space, a lot of documentation is done. The BA does requirements gathering and then creates a functional specification document, and then also creates a requirement or maybe a solution requirements document, and then comes up with all of these documentations, which of course also needs to be reviewed and approved. And then after that, it goes through another stage of maybe development of a business case, which of course will now go through another stage of development of the project plan. And then of course, all of these things are documentations that typically happen within the traditional space. So Agile now comes and says, instead of we focusing on these documentations, spending a lot of time on preparing these documents, is there no way we can channel that effort towards creating a working software? Not that we're not going to do any kind of documentation anyway, but then let it be minimalist. Let's just do as little documentation as possible, just enough that can give us an idea of what we want to develop, and then we hit the ground running. And that's essentially what the second aspect here is focusing on, which is working software over comprehensive documentation. Then the third manifesto, which talks about customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Within the traditional space, the customer is usually treated as a separate entity. And then in many cases, is not usually a part of the project team. But then Agile now comes and says, is there no way we can make this relationship even better? So that instead of it looking like a case of we have a contract somewhere, and then the other party is just waiting, for us to have, let's say, any particular, default or issue with the contract, so that there could be punitive measures, or so that there could be liabilities or even lawsuits. Is there no way we can bring in the customer or a customer representative here now in the person of a product owner to represent the interest of the customer and then be a part of the team, basically collaborating with the customer, as against we just following contract negotiations and terms as the case may be. And then the fourth manifesto says responding to change over following a plan. The traditional methodology is also known as plan-driven approach. And I did explain that part of the reason why it is called a plan-driven approach is because there's a saying within the traditional space that if it doesn't work on paper, it will not work in real life. So based on that, there's so much focus on planning. Now, Agile now comes and says, instead of we focusing so much on planning, yes, planning is good, no doubt. But then is there no way we can make it as minimalist as possible? And then instead of we trying to come up with a plan to prevent changes, is there no way we can make it possible for us to be welcoming to changes, even late in development? And that's essentially the fourth manifesto here, which says responding to change over following a plan. So this is not to say that the items you have on the right, which are, of course, detailing steps or things that are done within the traditional space, are all meaningless or valueless. But what we're simply saying is we value the items on the left more. And that's part of the reason why we have it this way, that it is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And this is essentially what the Agile Manifesto showcases. So in the next lesson, we're now going to take a look at the principles behind the Agile Manifesto. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we took a look at the Agile Manifesto. And then based on the Agile Manifesto, we now have what to refer to as the Agile Principles. And there are 12 of these principles, and we're going to be taking a look at the principles one after the other. So remember, we said that there are 4 Agile Manifesto, and the 4 Agile Manifesto we talked about, of course, included individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and then responding to change over following a plan. So based on this Agile Manifesto, we now have what to refer to as the principles. Principle is more or less an expansion of the Agile Manifesto, breaking it down into greater detail, and then simply saying that anybody who wants to carry out projects using the Agile methodology has to have this principle as a guiding framework to successfully be able to deploy or utilize the Agile methodology. So based on that, the first principle here states, our highest priority is to satisfy customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So Agile focuses on early delivery, doing development, and then doing it in short iterations. If you remember the study I discussed earlier, which talks about usage of features, in that particular illustration, we did explain that only about 20% of features are always or often utilized. If that's the case, if we're developing a product, for example, say we're developing an app or we're doing a software, the goal is to see how we can prioritize the features of this particular software so that the top priority features, which we'll refer to as the minimum marketable feature or minimum viable product, would be at the very top of our implementation. So the focus would be on how to implement these features as quickly and then as soon as possible in order for us to be able to deliver value to the customer. And then the second principle here states that welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Agile is welcoming to change. So if you have to abide by the Agile principle, it also means that you should be welcoming to changes, even late in development. So it simply means that even when we're about to release, hand over the product, and there is a need for a change, we can still make certain changes, or we can still make such changes. And then the third principle here says, deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to shorter time scale. And that's why within the Agile method, there is usually what we refer to as iterations. Iterations sometimes is also known as sprints. Sprints basically refer to a duration, typically short duration, within which we must get or have a working or a functional software. So usually, sprint durations can range between 1 to 4 weeks. So there are 1 week sprints, there are 2 week sprints, there are 3 week sprints, there are also 4 week sprints. But then shorter sprints or iterations is actually preferred, especially if you're using the Agile methodology. So you may consider doing a 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or at max, a 4 week sprint. Now, at the end of every sprint, how we measure progress within the sprint is that we must have a working software or an increment of value. So at the end of every sprint, there has to be something to showcase for it, or something that has already been added to those particular solutions that we may have been able to develop in the previous sprint. The fourth principle here states the business people and developers must work together daily during the project. So that's why within the Agile team or within the Scrum team, we have what we refer to as various roles. So there's the role of the Scrum Master, there's also the role of the product owner, and then there's the role of the developers. So this role is typically a cross-functional one that, of course, represents people from all fields and walks of life that their input may be required to effectively deliver the product. Beyond that, throughout the process of your project, there is now what we refer to as Scrum ceremonies, which of course we're going to take a look at in subsequent lessons. During those Scrum ceremonies, we also bring in some of those Scrum ceremonies, we also bring in relevant stakeholders to take part in those ceremonies. In that process, there's a collaboration and everybody is carried along in the course of the project itself. And that's essentially the essence of the fourth principle. The fifth principle says, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support their needs and trust them to get the work done. So within the Agile space, the Agile team is usually a self-organized team, self-organized and self-managed. In other words, even though you have different roles within the Agile team, those roles only perform functions as agreed upon by the team. In other words, nobody here works as a task driver or a manager, as the case may be. And then also, activities and functions are determined based on consensus. And in many cases, decisions are also taken based on consensus. So it's a self-managed, self-organized team. And it is built around individuals who are motivated to get the work done without being pushed around or forced to do so. And that's essentially the fifth principle. The sixth principle states that the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. Agile advocates face-to-face conversation. Obviously, you could tell face-to-face conversation still remains the best form of conversation and communication. However, with the advent of COVID, it is not impossible that we can use certain tools, say for example, Zoom, and then also maybe Google Meet and some of these other video conferencing tools to be able to also have a face-to-face collaboration. But then the whole idea is that communication is typically enhanced when there is face-to-face conversation. And that is one of the key principles that you have within the Agile framework. The seventh principle states that working software is the primary measure of progress. It simply means that the only thing that we can use to be able to determine how well we're doing in the project is that we're getting results. And what is the result? A working software. Results don't lie. So it shouldn't be a lot of activities and we're not seeing any result. So that's why the goal, especially within the agile space, is to get the work done and deliver a working software. I remember back then during my career as a salesperson, and then when we have our monthly performance review, our regional manager will typically ask us, how many sales have we made? And then some of us as salespeople then will begin to say, okay, a customer promised to buy this amount of quantities. And then our regional manager will just smile and say, okay, it therefore means that when it comes to paying your salary, we're also going to make you promises that we're going to pay your salary since you're making us promises that you're going to make sales. So in essence, what he's trying to emphasize there is it's either you've made a sale or you've not made a sale. So there is no go between or certain activities that can now be used to represent sales. No. So that's also the same principle or mindset that is typically used within the Agile framework, that a working software, the key emphasis is working. A working software is the primary measure of progress. The eighth principle states that agile processes promote sustainable development. So sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So within the agile framework, there is what we refer to as velocity. Velocity simply means the rate of at which the team moves. When I mention the rate at which the team moves, I'm simply talking about how much work the team is able to do within a particular sprint or iteration. So the amount of work the team is able to do within that sprint or iteration is what we refer to as velocity. Of course, I'm going to be explaining these concepts in detail in subsequent lessons, but just follow my narration as we proceed. The ninth principle here states continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. So within the Agile framework, quality is inspected into the solution. It therefore means that there are a couple of ceremonies or events that we hold within the Agile environment that ensures that we get good results. And those ceremonies, of course, would include, we have what we call the daily Scrum. There's also the retrospectives, and then also the sprint planning, as well as the sprint review. We're going to cover all of these ceremonies in detail as we journey along. And then the 10th principle here states that simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. So here, Agile is simply saying, keep it simple. Within the Agile framework, we'll try to keep work as simple as possible. We also try to keep the processes as simplified as much as we can. No complexities. We use everyday tools. For example, use your 4x4 index card or your normal sticky notes. And then, of course, you create a chart, a burn-down chart using a graph, and then maybe a Kanban board. These are some of the ways you can actually carry out your work. And then also try as much as possible to break down your user stories or work that has to be done in the project in simple terms to simplify it for the purpose of implementation. So this principle is simply saying for Agile to work best, keep it simple. And then the 11th principle here states that the best architecture, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. This is quite similar to the principle number 5 that talks about build projects around motivated individuals. In that particular principle, we talked about that within the Agile environment, the team is usually self-organized. Self-organized simply means that the team decides on how to carry out its functions. The team decides on how to implement things within the project itself. So it is a collaborative effort. It is not a case where somebody is giving directives or instructions, as the case may be, or insisting, or is serving as a go-between between that, the team and some other stakeholders. No. So within the Agile space, the team is self-organized. and carries out functions majorly based on consensus and then also on understanding, especially when they are not able to reach consensus. And then the final part now says, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. If you listen quite attentively, I did mention that there are 4 ceremonies that typically takes place within the Agile framework. They include 1, we have the sprint planning. So the sprint planning is where we come up with the set of user stories to implement within a particular sprint. And then one key thing we also establish here is the goal for that particular sprint, what to be done, who will do it, and then also how it will be done. And then another key ceremony that happens within the Agile space is what we refer to as the daily Scrum. This is the daily 15-minute stand-up meeting that the team typically holds to be able to determine and discuss development flow. There's also what is referred to as the sprint review. So the sprint review is the 3rd Agile ceremony. This is basically where the team now takes a look at what has been accomplished within that particular sprint and then demonstrates it to relevant stakeholders. So sprint review is basically where the team showcases the result or what is as accomplished within a particular sprint or iteration and then gets feedback and then, of course, retunes and tries to improve on it subsequently. And then the final one is now the retrospectives. So the retrospectives is where the team now comes together to do a lessons learned session and then ask themselves what they did correctly that should be retained in subsequent sprints, what was not done correctly that should be discontinued in subsequent sprints, and then if there are opportunities to improvement in order to adapt and then adjust their behaviors accordingly. All of that is in line with this principle number 12, which mentions the fact that there's a need for the team at regular intervals to actually hold sessions and reflect on how to become more effective, and then, of course, tunes and adjust its behavior accordingly. These are essentially the 12 Agile principles that serves as the bedrock for implementing the Agile methodology. So Agile has been increasingly developed. If you remember, in the previous lesson, at a point, I mentioned that 17 practitioners came together to give us these terms, and then also the Agile manifesto that we have here. So these are individuals, or those 17 practitioners who, one way or the other, came up with the Agile manifesto, because they include the likes of Ken Beck, Mike Biddle, Ariel Van Bennekom, Alistair Cogburn, also Ward Cunningham, Martin Fowler, James Grenham, Jim Highsmith, Andrew Hunt, Ron Jeffries, John Kern, Brian Marrick, Robert C. Martin, Steve Mellor, Ken Schauber, Jeff Sutherland, and then Dave Thomas. These individuals were instrumental to the development of the Agile Manifesto, as well as the 12 Agile principles that we just talked about. So we have taken a look at the 12 principles that we have in Agile, and then also taking a look at the authors of the Agile Manifesto. In the next lesson, we're going to be taking a look at Agile Project Management Framework, and then also give a definition of Scrum. Welcome back. Remember, in the last lesson, we took a look at the 12 Agile principles, as well as authors of the Agile Manifesto. So here we're going to be taking a look at the Agile project management itself. In further comparison between Agile and the traditional project management, we shall take a look at what we refer to as the traditional iron triangle. This is also known as the triple constraint or traditional project management triangle. So within the traditional space, there is basically what is referred to as the iron triangle. And the iron triangle is predicated on the fact that there are 3 key constraints that projects typically go through, which are scope, cost, and then schedule. Proponents of the traditional methodology typically, in most times, and for most traditional projects, have a fixed scope. And then, of course, cost and schedule may now vary. So what that simply means is, in many a times, once within the traditional framework, we've been able to define the scope of the project. Say, for example, the project is to construct a 3-bedroom bungalow. And once that scope has been defined, the key objective is to see how we're able to accomplish or fulfill that particular goal. And then in that process, we may have variations in cost and then also variations in schedule, which is usually the case, especially as it pertains to traditional project management. However, within the Agile space, this iron triangle is now reversed. So many a times, the iron triangle is now illustrated face down. So again, we have the scope, then we have the cost, and then we have the schedule. So what Agile is now saying is, within the Agile space, cost and schedule is usually static. And then, of course, scope can change. What this is saying is that cost and schedule is usually fixed. And then based on that, we now determine the scope or the amount of work that can be accomplished. Now, if you remember, when I was giving the illustration of the traditional iron triangle with the traditional method, I said first, we define the scope. And then in the process, cost and schedule may vary. But then for an Agile project, what happens is there is usually a time box. So typically, you begin with a time box, which is how long it will take us before we accomplish this set of work or this set of features. So everything within the Agile process is time boxed. And time box is basically the maximum allowable amount of time it should take to accomplish a particular thing within an Agile framework. So let's say we want to develop an app. In an Agile framework, this app that we're developing is more or less driven by time box than features. In essence, more or less driven by time box and cost than scope. So this app, for example, we say we're going to go live at the end of 3 months. So the goal is to see how much work can be accommodated within this 3 months period. And so that's why you notice that cost is fixed and then also schedule is fixed. So the amount of work that can be accommodated within those 3 months is now what we're going to be using as the scope. And that's why we say that schedule and cost is fixed and then scope can vary. The knowledge of this now gave rise to what is now referred to as the Agile triangle. So within the Agile triangle, there are 3 key components. We have value, which is basically extrinsic value, which is also refers to as extrinsic quality. In other words, extrinsic because value is more or less value or quality derived by the customer or the end user. And that's what we refer to as value. So in essence, by value, we're referring to those things that users or customers would get out of that particular product. So here you're talking about features, functionalities, or benefits inherent in the product. And then quality, which is also referred to as intrinsic value. This now refers to things like compliance, capability, availability. In essence, how well the product is able to consistently keep delivering value to the customers. And that's now what we refer to as quality. So in essence, this basically refers to warranty, which is fit for purpose. And then there's now the constraints part. So the constraints is now what is made up of those triple constraints that we saw in the inverted triangle, which of course includes cost, schedule, and then scope. So the idea of the Agile triangle is simply saying that if you as a customer wants any of this combination, then we need a trade-off on at least one other portion of the triangle. So I remember then during my sales career, we're told that there are 3 things we can offer. 1 is cheap, 2 is speed, and then 3 is quality. But then that at any point in time, a customer can only have 2 out of the 3. For example, if the customer wants it cheap and fast, then obviously quality will be compromised. Or If the customer wants speed and quality, then it won't be cheap. Or if the customer wants it cheap and then also quality, then we can't do it very fast. This is also the same concept that pertains to the Agile triangle. At any point in time, if we're developing or carrying out a project using the Agile methodology, if we're hoping to deliver on value, that is, meet the feature specifications, and then also deliver on quality, that is, meet the needs for durability, availability, and then fitness for purpose as well as fitness for use. If that's the case, we should make a trade-off of cost, schedule, and scope, because we need a lot of cost, a lot of time, and then also scope in order to be able to meet value and quality. If you want value and then also have, let's say, a limited budget and schedule, then in many cases, it's going to affect the quality of the product. Same way, if we combine quality and then also we do it fast and then in a cost-effective manner, it is also going to affect the value or extrinsic quality that customers will get. So the goal in Agile project management is to see how we are able to deliver value and quality within the constraints of cost, schedule, and scope. So now that we have taken a look at the Agile triangle, next we're going to talk about the Agile project management framework. So this framework gives us a summary of typically what happens within an Agile project management framework. And it's quite similar to the 5 process groups that we have in the PMP. In the PMP, which is Project Management Professional, the Project Management Institute states that typically project goes through 5 major stages, which are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, which I'll call M&C, and then closing. So the PMI, that is the Project Management Institute, explains that initiating refers to all the activities that we do to enable us start or kickstart the project. So this is where you talk about developing the project charter, the business case, and doing stakeholder identification. Then planning is where we determine the how, the when, and then also the how much for the project. So this is basically where we come up with a plan for the project implementation. Executing is where we do the work of the project. So here you talk about implementation and then doing the project work. Monitoring and controlling is where you check to be able to determine how effective is our implementation compared to our plan. And then closing refers to all the activities that we carry out in order to bring the project to an end. And that we refer to as closing. Within the Agile project management, this particular set of steps or process groups is now adapted. And the adaptation then gave us what we refer to as envision. Envision is synonymous to what you do during the initiating of the project. Then there's now speculate. Speculate is synonymous to what you do in the PMI's planning. And then there's explore, which is, of course, synonymous to executing. Then there's now adapt. Adapt is also synonymous to monitoring and controlling in the traditional space. And then there is now close, which is also synonymous to closing, the closing process group in the traditional space. So within the Agile framework, what happens during the envision stage is basically this is where the vision for the project is developed. Then aside from that, this is also where we define the project scope and then also create the project community and be able to constitute a team that will carry out the project. All of these are key activities that take place during the envisioning stage of the project. Then there's now the speculate. Speculate basically refers to the stage where you come up with your iterations. For example, how many sprints or iterations would it take to implement the project? This is also where you come up with your iteration plans, that is, plan for each of those iterations. And then also your release plan, specific milestones. All of these are what you do during the speculate stage. So part of the inputs we need in speculating would include the feature list. In other words, all the features that we need to carry out or achieve in that particular project, we are able to now determine how essentially we are going to be able to do them. So the output of this process would be our plan, typically our release plan, that will now capture how we're going to be able to release and then also go live and make the particular product that we're developing available to users. Then there's now the explore. Explore is where we now deliver the features in short iterations. This is what happens during the exploration stage. So just delivery takes place in sprints. That is short time frame, and it is continuously adapted, which is now what takes us to the adaptation. Adaptation is where we receive feedback about the deliverables, make relevant corrections or amendments, or come up with improvement in subsequent sprints. And then you now come up with the final product, after which you now close the project. So this has to do with concluding the project and then also passing along lessons learned that were uncovered during the course of the project itself. And that's what happens during the close part of the Agile project management framework. So taking a look at this in greater detail, you can see here, envision is where we determine the product vision, the project scope, the project community, and how the team will work together. During the speculate stage, this is where we develop a feature-based release, milestone, and iteration plan to deliver on the vision. During this explore, this is where we deliver tested features in a short time frame, which of course is referred to as iteration, and constantly seeking to reduce the risk and uncertainty of the project. And then in adapt, here we review the delivered results, the current situation, and the team's performance, and then adapt as necessary. Then during the close, this is where you conclude the project, pass along key learnings, and then also celebrate. These are essentially the stages that a typical Agile project management goes through. We have been able to take a look at least in brief, the Agile framework. And remember, I did explain earlier that within the Agile framework, there are now different methodologies. One of those methodologies is the Scrum methodology. In subsequent lessons, we're going to be taking a look at the Scrum methodology, and then we shall also be taking a look at the various certifications that you have in Scrum, and then take a look at other artifacts as it pertains to Scrum. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. So in the previous lesson, we took a look at the Agile project management framework, where we basically talked about the envision, speculate, explore, adapt, and then of course close. In this lesson, we're now going to be diving into Scrum. So when we ask the question, what is Scrum? Scrum is basically an Agile methodology that was developed in order to solve a couple of challenges that arose due to using traditional methodology in software development. We took a look at some of those challenges before, and that's essentially what now gave rise to the Scrum methodology. So the question now is, what is Scrum? Remember, like I did explain, that we have what we call the Agile project management framework. And then within the Agile project management framework, there are different methodologies, of which Scrum is one of the methodologies. So Scrum is basically an Agile methodology. And when we say that a particular thing is an Agile methodology, what we're simply saying is that that particular methodology or approach is in line with the Agile principles. If you remember those 12 principles we did mention, so it simply means that Scrum actually adheres to those 12 principles and by extension adheres to the Agile Manifesto. So Scrum was actually developed by Ken Schwaber, Mike Biddle, and then of course, Jeff Sutherland. And they are the publishers of the Scrum guidelines, which of course can be found in Scrum Alliance website, that is scrumalliance.com, or if you go to scrum.org, you're also going to see the Scrum guidelines. Of course, I also upload a copy of that particular document, so just in case you want to have access to it. So most of the things we teach in Scrum actually comes from that particular guideline. All the content that you're seeing in this course was actually developed using the Scrum guideline. So the Scrum guideline basically gives us a breakdown of all the practices in Scrum. And typically, I suggest that you read it as well in preparation for your exam. The name Scrum actually comes from the game of rugby. And most of the practices that are typically used in Scrum is also adopted from the game of rugby. For example, the daily stand-up, and then also the Scrum itself originated from rugby. So all of these things are part of what is adopted in the Scrum methodology. Scrum is the most popular Agile methodology. Over 70% of Agile projects actually utilize the Scrum methodology. So you see why most times when people think of Agile, they think of Scrum. And that's why most times you get to hear about Agile Scrum. Hardly do people even hear about the other methodologies, which of course I explained included the extreme programming, the DSDM, the ATAN, and then aside from that, you also have the APM as well. But Scrum is the most popular of all of these framework. So the level of awareness as well as demand for Scrum is quite high. And that is why a lot of certifications are actually built around the Scrum methodology. So if we take a look at some of the certifications that you have around the Scrum methodology, one of it is the CSM, which is the Certified Scrum Master. The Certified Scrum Master is offered by Scrum Alliance. So if you go to scrumalliance.org, you would, read more about the Certified Scrum Master. It offers other certifications as well, which of course includes Certified Scrum Product Owner, as well as Certified Scrum Practitioner and Certified Scrum Trainer, CST. For you to become a certified Scrum Master with Scrum Alliance, you need to attend the training offered by a certified Scrum trainer. So in essence, Scrum Alliance CSM certification is not fully democratized because first, you need to attend a training organized by them, anchored by a CST, a certified Scrum trainer, who will now be the one to submit your application. So you simply send your details to your certified Scrum trainer, and then this person will submit your application, and then your application will now be evaluated, and if passes, then you will now be granted access to take the exam. So once your application is approved, you are now expected to take the exam. So there are 50 questions in the CSM Certified Scrum Master examination. The duration for the exam is 60 minutes, which is 1 hour. And then the pass score for the exam is 74%. It therefore means you need to get at least 37 of the questions correctly for you to become a certified Scrum Master. It's also worthy of note that you actually have a take two option. So just in case you don't pass in the first sitting, Scrum Alliance typically offers its candidates another shot or go at the exam itself. The pricing for the Certified Scrum Master varies depending on the certified Scrum trainer. And then, of course, most times this certification training is not available online, but with recent developments in COVID, a couple of the instructor-led trainings led by a certified Scrum trainer are now available online. And then, of course, there are just still very few institutions that offer such training. So the cost depends on the institution itself, but most times it ranges between $1,000 to $2,500, including the training and the certification exam. And like I did explain, it purely depends on the institute. Aside from the Certified Scrum Master, there's also the PSM, which is the Professional Scrum Master. The Professional Scrum Master certification is more democratized. It doesn't have a stringent requirement that you must be trained by the institute before you can take the certification exam. So in essence, anybody can actually take the Professional Scrum Master certification exam. In fact, you can do a self-study or watch this video, take personal courses, and then you will be able to take the exam. So this is offered by Ken Schwaber. All you simply need to do is you go to scrum.org website, and then of course, register on the website, and then select certification. Then from there, you're going to see the professional Scrum Master. You select it, you pay, and then you book your exams. There are two levels for the professional Scrum Master. You have the PSM1, and then there's the PSM2. The professional Scrum Master one, you will contend with a total of 80 questions within 60 minutes. So there are 80 questions in 60 minutes. So you can see that while for the professional Scrum Master, no official training is required, but then the exam itself is much more stringent than the certified Scrum Master exams. So here you will contend with 80 questions as against 50 questions that you have in the CSM exam. Same duration of 60 minutes. And then while the passing score for the certified Scrum Master is 74%, for the professional Scrum Master, the passing score is a whooping 85%. So that's part of the reason why I advise that you take this, you take a look at this video repeatedly, and then also do the practice questions repeatedly for you to be able to pass the exam in one sitting. Then there's also the PSM2. PSM2 exam questions are more situational styled based questions. And that's typically how PSM2 exam questions actually appear. The PSM2 actually measures your ability to utilize the Scrum in a real-life environment. So that's why I mentioned that the questions in PSM2 are usually situational style. The questions are longer and they appear a bit more confusing. There are 30 questions in the PSM2 exams, and then you'd have to answer those 30 questions in 90 minutes. In essence, 1 hour, 30 minutes. That's the duration for the PSM2 exam. Again, the passing score for the PSM2 is also 85%. Sometimes people ask if they must take PSM1 before they can take PSM2. The answer is no. You can actually choose to do any one. Either you take the PSM1 and then take PSM2 subsequently, or you can also go in straight and take the PSM2 examination. But usually, I advise you take the PSM1 first before you take the PSM2, because with that, you'll be able to have a strong foundation to be able to take the PSM2 exam. The PSM1 exam is costed, the PSM1 exam fee is $150, while for the PSM2, you are expected to spend, while for the PSM2, you are expected to pay $250 for the examination itself. So again, the certification, your application is submitted as scrum.org, and then once you submit it and make payment, you can schedule and write your exam at any point in time. Aside from the professional Scrum Master, there's also what we call the PMI ACP. PMI ACP is another Agile certification, but does not focus primarily on Scrum. So it also includes other Agile methodologies. Of course, for details on this, you can check out my course on this particular platform on PMI ACP. Once you click on my profile, you would see the list of my courses, and then you can take the PMI ACP course from there. So the PMI ACP is issued by the Project Management Institute, that is the PMI, and then this is more generical. In other words, it includes other Agile practices. There are certain stringent requirements to be eligible for the PMI ACP certification. One is you must have 12 months general project management experience. In other words, at least 2 years experience in project management, and then 8 months Agile project management experience. Then you also need to take a 21 contact hours of Agile training. Aside from that, the exam itself is 120 multiple choice question. The duration for the exam is 3 hours, so you have to contend with 120 questions within the 3 hours period. Of course, you need to submit your application on pmi.org, wait for approval, then of course pay for the certification, and then you can take the exam. So once you get certified, you need to renew your certification every 3 years. And you renew your certification by reporting PDUs and then also by paying your renewal fees. So these are some very popular certifications in Agile that you may choose to take, two of which focused on Scrum, and then also there's the PMI ACP. Of course, there's also the Exin Agile Scrum Master, which is also very popular. Exin Agile Scrum certification. And then, of course, PeopleSat also has its own version of Agile Scrum Master certifications. One thing you need to understand about all of these Scrum certifications is that their content are basically the same. So with this particular training, any of the certifications you choose to go for, whether it is the Professional Scrum Master, the Certified Scrum Master, Exin Agile Scrum Master, or PeopleSat Scrum Master, you will be able to take the exam confidently and then also do well in the certification exam. So this brings us effectively to the end of the introduction to Agile Scrum. And if you remember, here we took a look at why Scrum. And we said that Scrum is quite necessary because it is one of the most popular Agile framework, and that most software projects are actually now being developed using the Agile methodology. Then we also talked about the Agile Manifesto. In the Agile Manifesto, we took a look at 4 of those Agile Manifesto, which of course includes individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and then responding to change over following a plan. We went ahead to also take a look at Agile principles. And then aside from that, we talked about the Agile project management framework, where we took a look at the various stages in an Agile project management, which of course covered envision stage, speculate, explore, adapt, and then also close. And then we talked about Scrum, gave a brief introduction of what Scrum is all about. And finally, we took a look at the various certifications that you have within the Scrum methodology. All of these and many more were part of what we discussed in the very first lesson, which is Introduction to Scrum. Next, we're going to see questions and answers. Please do well to answer the questions that will come up in the quiz. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.